Okay. So the title of my project is "Oh, to Have Somewhere to Lay My Head, Afro-Caribbean Identity, Digital Religion, and the Creation of Sacred Space." The title comes from an African-American gospel song that I will not sing for you, but it is essentially in search of a place for the singer to have a place to rest and to have a space to feel safe. And I chose to use it because I feel that the work that I did really encapsulates sort of how people in this community have created this safe space for themselves in entirely a digital space. So I'll begin with my theory and methods. First, I'll highlight Stuart Hall, who has actually informed most of my work. He is a Jamaican-born UK scholar who examines the tension between the Indigenous and colonized self. He uses the phrase diasporic and settled identity. And essentially what he does is highlight the amount of brain power, the amount of body power, and even the amount of social power it takes to really assimilate oneself to a space that is not made for them. As a minority growing up in the United Kingdom, he has felt all of this very acutely within himself. And because of that, he dedicated his life to work in that space, very specifically looking at the diaspora of the Afro-Caribbean community and how it existed and thrived in these colonized spaces all over the world. I also put into conversation with him Aisha Beliso de Jesus, who wrote the book Electric Santeria, and she is focused on the sensoriums of the electrified body as well as systems of power as related to religion. So her work is mostly focused on how screens can actively affect the borders of self, especially when it comes to religious spaces and rituals, and how those individuals then share that self and that newly bleeding edge with others around them. I use this in relation mainly to the curated self of social media feeds, so it looks less like the internal identity creation and more how people interact with one another, how their perceived identity is then put on a screen. And lastly, I put into conversation with that Heidi Campbell, who really is considered, she wrote her book in the 90s, and so she's considered one of the creators of the theory of digital religion and the reality of online practice for mainly churches, but made it broad enough that it can be used for most communities. And in that, the social shaping of technology is the main focus of her work. And so essentially the social shaping of technology assumes that technology and society exist in a mutual shaping process, and that symbolic nature can be very important to religious users of the internet or of technology in general, because it implies that as we shape that technology for our own use, it shapes us in ways that can seem almost mystic, can be very flexible. And so putting these three in conversation with one another really informed my work. So for methods, I wanted to get an idea of the full digital landscape of this community. So the focus of the project was really that breadth instead of depth. I approached this qualitative work through a thorough combination of virtual interviews, participant observation, and data scraping of social media feeds, focused on a very small data set. So that way I could create a comprehensive picture. For data scraping, I used NVivo, which is a qualitative data analysis software. It allowed me to import tweets and posts from social media platforms to then analyze them and cross-reference them. I found that I was pulled towards using YouTube and Facebook, but for the most part, YouTube is very hard to analyze, and Facebook, though it is not a friendly space for coding, it certainly was useful in other ways, which I will get into. So in my data, I wanted to share a quick quote from one of my individuals that I interviewed. And she said, "When I was younger, I avoided traditionally Black practices, including Egyptian magic, hoodoo/voodoo, and various African practices. I was young and confused. I found that connecting to these have helped me feel more secure in myself and my race. My practice has always been an important part of my personal identity, and connecting to practices that relate to my own ethnic history helps to enhance my feeling of authenticity." Now, not every piece of data supported that exact statement, but I did find that many people who are part of these spiritual communities do cite their ethnic identity as something that informs their practice, either in a positive or a negative way, but it is something that absolutely is at the forefront of their minds. This particular person utilized Facebook and her own website most often as a way of communicating with her community. And I would like to note that Facebook is actually where I saw the most of communal interactions. Facebook operates as a learning space for this community with lessons, study groups, hold units, shared resources. People ask questions about their practice and look for resources and look for help and aid from the community on this platform. And they also practice other aspects of this religion, such as tarot or aura readings for one another virtually, using this classroom space as well. This is another example of the type of data that I used. This is an example of the Twitter feed, of one Twitter feed that I would use. And these are just the codes that came up the most often. So essentially, I looked at what hashtags people were using on Twitter, and then I coded them into NVivo. And whenever I would find a new hashtag, I would just add it on and see how many times it was referenced between, the 5 or 6 individuals that were part of my data set. And so I found that in these threads, the most interesting to track were actually the self-love and community tag. The self-love tag is an expression of a particular user's confidence, but was utilized by this person more often than anybody else, and also used to uphold other people. So it was a self-love, but also a love of the community, meaning that they consider themselves in the African American space and that they don't really find a way to separate it. The community tag as well is interesting because they equally reference both cultural and spiritual knowledge and interactions. And I did find that actually this religious community depended a lot on popular culture, things that are related to Black culture and traditions, not really even spiritual as would be sort of defined in a religious studies context, but spiritual and sacred to them because it is from their Blackness. On Twitter, I also found that social marketplace aspect that I mentioned earlier. With Twitter, essentially everyone who's using these tags, who is creating these personas, they are essentially creating a shop front to offer their practices, to offer their resources, or even to offer what they're selling. So they make mojo bags for everyone and they sell them, or they're writing their own books and they're selling them as resources, or they're doing live readings for people, but because they're professionals, they are actively doing more in detail. So it's not necessarily about practice. This is where professionals live, which is a distinct difference from Facebook. I also found that memes are a very important part of this communication style as well, that visual communication. These are highly specialized visualized jokes that strengthen the bonds of people who are communicating with one another. In this case, the community pulls from aspects of popular culture, like I said, such as nostalgic television, or even pulling from traditional pagan influence, such as the Rider-Waite Tarot. So this form of communication is unique in that it was utilized on every single platform that I studied. finally, I would like to show just how the theory, the data end up in my argument. So the theory does connect the importance of cultural knowledge and the questions of power to the creation of sacred space. And it shows that members of the community do focus not on religious practice, but rather the sense of belonging that comes with it. And I argue that that is due entirely to the sense of empowerment and agency that come from creating and maintaining this space. This digital landscape is distinctly specialized. I mentioned that Twitter is a marketplace, Facebook is a classroom, and even in other spaces such as Discord or other chat boards, they even function separately outside of those. So this is highly organized, and I think this highly organized space is because people are searching for that agency, that organization allows them the control, and it allows them the confidence that they may not be able to access in the physical world. I wanted to also give a quick update. During the pandemic, this community has been very, very active because it's online. So in response to the social uprising ignited by the murder of George Floyd, this community has linked with other online pagan spaces that are allies to the Afro-Caribbean cause in order to hold large-scale virtual rituals. This further showcases how this practice can be read as a reactionary pushback to a larger society that does minoritize and does disenfranchise these individuals. So it's rooted again in the empowerment of minorities, even when allies are involved. And I thought it was interesting, so I wanted to add it in. And that is my presentation. Thank you so much.